All right, so welcome to Introduction to Philosophy. And for this course, we're using Donald Palmer's Looking at Philosophy, The Unbearable Heaviness of Philosophy Made Lighter. So if you're watching this on my YouTube channel or wherever and you want to follow along, I highly recommend this book. He does a nice job in taking an incredibly difficult and intimidating topic and making it, I think, quite manageable. But then again, I'm a philosopher, so maybe I'm not the one to ask. So let's start at the beginning. Philosophy comes from two Greek words, philo, which means love, and sophia, which means wisdom. So literally, philosophy means the love of wisdom. That being the case, why do you think so many people, and I'm talking in a Christian context, why do so many Christians seem to be hostile towards philosophy if it means the love of wisdom? Any thoughts on that, class?
Maybe because not all philosophers are Christians.
Well, that's for sure.
And some of the ideas in philosophy, like consequentialism, are a little barbaric.
Right, and they can be downright hostile to Christianity, right? And so I think that's what's happened with, especially with modern and then many aspects of postmodern philosophy. It has been hostile to Christianity, and so many people, 20th, 21st century Christians in particular, have seen philosophy as like an enemy or a danger. Whereas in the medieval period, and you'll see that as we go through this class, philosophy and theology are virtually synonymous throughout the medieval period. I'll never forget when I was taking philosophy at San Diego State in one of my graduate level classes. We were doing medieval philosophy, and one of the students was just so exasperated, and they said, "Why do we have to keep dragging God into everything?" And the professor just looked at her and said, "Because we're doing medieval philosophy. God is everywhere and in all the philosophers. They were all theologians as well as philosophers." But we're going to start here. I want to qualify this. This is primarily a look at Western philosophies. And by Western, I'm talking about coming from the Greeks, traveling through Europe, and then to America. So that's kind of the lineage we're going to follow. Now, there were certainly incredible philosophers in the East as well as in Africa, in the Americas, and I do offer another course called Cross-Cultural Philosophy, where it's really neat because we'll be doing a lot of the same topics, like, say, epistemology, the theory of knowledge. We won't just hear from Plato and Aristotle and Kant, but we'll also hear from, like, Lao Tzu or Kung Fu Sei, or we'll hear different African or female or Native American voices in the conversation. And I absolutely love that class, and I think especially living in California, it's so good to have an idea where different people are coming from and their philosophic traditions. So if you're still around next year and you want to take that class, I will be offering that in the fall as well. But for the sake of this class, it's not because those other voices aren't important, it's simply they've chosen the Western tradition or lineage to follow. And so we're going to start with the Greeks, even though we certainly had the wisdom of the Egyptians, the Babylonians, the Hebrews. The Greeks get credit with starting philosophy for a couple of reasons. And the guy we're going to start with, and let's start with that. Palmer actually starts with explaining why the Greeks had the freedom to do philosophy. And he points out that in Egypt, there was such a strong religious priestly caste that anyone who had any divergent ideas or thoughts outside of that could be in peril of their life, right, or livelihood. The same thing, think of the Hebrews. We have Solomon in the Bible portrayed as the wisest man who ever lived. Why doesn't he get to be the first philosopher? Well, it's because of where his wisdom came from. How does the Bible tell us Solomon got his wisdom?
He asked for it from God in a dream, and God he loved his request that he gave him that, riches, and
Yes.
I don't think he gave him long life, but I have to check that.
I'm trying to think. I think he lived a decent amount of time, at least for his day. But you're right. He got it supernaturally. The difference with the Greeks is they're not counting on the gods or the god to give them wisdom. They are using their own observation, their own human intellect, their own experiences of the world to then think and contemplate about things and try to come up with ideas of why things are the way they are. And so that's why we're starting with the Greeks. Another interesting thing about the Greeks is their geography. If you've ever been to Greece or you've seen it on a map, you see it's made up of many like peninsulas and isthmuses and islands. And because of that terrain, the mountainous terrain, the cities of Greece became like states unto themselves. In fact, their word for it was the polis, the city-state. And that's how they identified. So if we were ancient Greeks, we wouldn't be thinking of ourselves as Americans or Californians. We would be thinking of ourselves as San Diegans or Santians. And we would have a different culture, different ideas, different loyalties than, say, the Los Angelians or the San Franciscans or the Denverans or those sorts of groups, because people saw their city as like their parent, the people that gave them life, the people that raised them, the people that protected them, the people that taught them what is the good, what is the true, what is the beautiful. You're all being enculturated by these cultures. And so that's where the ancient Greek mindset was. And it allowed them to flourish. And we'll find the earliest philosophers in the Western canon come from what's now modern day Turkey. But if you're familiar with ancient history, the coast of ancient Turkey was colonized by Greeks, right? You had Greek city-states, and you see those a lot in the Bible. If you look at your first century map of the Bible, you'll see the cities like Ephesus, right? Miletus, and these are where our first philosophers are going to start. So Asia Minor or modern day Turkey, across the isthmus there, the Bosphorus, and into Asia, basically, that coast of Asia, of the Aegean Sea. And so we're going to start with Thales. And Thales, his claim to fame, he gets the grand title of father of philosophy, or I think it would be fairer to qualify it the father of Western philosophy. And what was amazing about Thales was he was able to accurately predict an eclipse of the sun. And now people had predicted eclipses of the sun before, but it had always been done through supernatural means. Like, for example, at the Oracle of Delphi, people would go in and sacrifice a chicken or an animal. The priest or the oracle would read the entrails, and they could give you all sorts of prophecies, which sometimes did not come true. Thales was able to predict an eclipse of the sun, not because some god whispered in his ear or some daemon gave him inspiration, but he was a keen observer of the physical material world. And this is the first category I want to give to you in this class. The first series of philosophers we're going to discuss all come under the category of monistic materialist. A monist, think of monocle, it's someone that believes in one thing. A materialist, philosophically speaking, is someone who only believes in the physical material world. So, for example, you have a body, but not a soul or spirit. You have a brain, not a mind. Does this make sense to you? So, anything not physical material for the ancient Greeks did not exist. Now, even if they do talk about a soul or spirits or gods or goddesses, think about that in the Greco-Roman world. Even the gods and goddesses of the Greeks are physical material beings. They're not just spirit, they have physicality to them, and they can even suffer and die. So this is a very different types of gods than the Judeo-Christian concept of God. So get that in your mind first. So these are materialists. They believe only the physical material world exists, but the early Greeks are looking for one underlying substance. And in a really great commentary, if this is like super thin, like it's a great for an intro book, but it's really thin. if you want to get a little beefier, you can look at Copleston's series of, he does a commentary on the history of philosophy, Copleston. And he uses a German word called Urstoff. And Urstoff means the underlying substance from which all things come. It's way easier saying Urstoff than the underlying substance from which all things come every time. So that's what it means when you hear me roll out that German word, Urstoff. So they're trying to look at what is it that precedes everything else. And Thales, in addition to predicting this eclipse, and he did that by simply observing the paths of the sun and the moon, and he was able to predict when they were overlap. I mean, brilliant, right? And we can actually use modern day astronomy to look back, and we actually have an exact date for the beginning of philosophy. And I think it's something like 585 BC, May 25th or something. I'd have to double check, but we can actually look on the day of that eclipse that he predicted. And it wowed all his contemporaries. But in addition to that, he was trying to figure out what could it be. And the first cartoon in the book, or the second one, he has a picture of this like cow, right? And here's this cow eating grass, but he's trying to figure out, how do we get from grass to milk? What is going on in this animal that is eating one material object, and yet it is producing poop and urine and milk? How is all that coming from grass? There must be some underlying thing that is manifesting in different ways. And Thales came up with this idea that the one underlying substance of all things is water. And water...
You also word that question as, like, how does a chicken turn hay into an egg? Or how does a tree turn oxygen into carbon dioxide into oxygen? Or...
Ooh, good example. We'll come back to the trees. Thank you. I would have forgot about it. Thanks, Christine. And so water is such a great guess for an ancient Greek, because the Greeks would have seen water in liquid form, in gas form, and solid form. And so here you have one substance or element that can be both solid, liquid, and gas. And so brilliant, right? Now, today, I don't know any physicist or chemist that think water is the underlying substance of all things. But I think it's similar to like how Sigmund Freud is revered. There's very few Freudians, practicing Freudians today, but he asks questions to start a different trajectory of thinking and exploration of the human soul and psyche. And I think that's similar to Thales. Very few people would say his conclusions were how things actually are, but he got the Western mind thinking along these patterns. And so I think he's of great value in that sense. So water, here you have this substance, and out of water he sees everything you can imagine in the world. And take humans, for example. I think we're made up of something close to like 70% water. Our physicality we're like water beings, water babies. We are like embodied water moving around in the world. And so that's super interesting. And that's really all I want you to know for Thales, is his system of using observation. He's not going by what the priests tell him, what the Oracle of Delphi told him, what his mama told him, but he's questioning even his own culture, even this idea of the gods, right? But you have to be careful, because polytheism in this culture, even though it wasn't like Egypt or the Hebrews, if you disregarded or disrespected the gods, it could cost you even your life. And that's what happened to Socrates. He offended the sensibilities of the Athenians, and when we get to him, you'll see he's kind of like the first martyr of philosophy, because he wouldn't kowtow to the gods of Athens, and he upset a lot of people doing so, as you can imagine. All right. Any questions on Thales before we do our next guy? All right. So our next guy is called Anaximander. And Anaximander, he was actually a disciple of Thales, also coming from Miletus, and the dates I have for him is 610 to 546. And remember, these are BCE dates, so they start bigger and get smaller as they come to the year 0. And at the year 0, we come into CE, Common Era. Now, this is very different than the numbering when I grew up. We had BC and then AD. So BCE...
Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. I will never call it BCE and CE.
Well, in certain circles, you may need to, Christina, if you want people to understand what you're talking about. And so I'm very comfortable moving back and forth. But here's a simple question, and don't be obnoxious about it, but simply ask people, when did the Common Era begin? And the Common Era begins with the birth of Christ. And so, you have to remember the incredible influence Christianity has had on Western culture, even from the days of the week to how we list years. Our whole calendar is based around the event of Christ. And so we have BC before Christ, and then Anno Domini in the year of our Lord after Christ, the Latin for the year of our Lord. So that's where we get those terms from. The book, this is obviously coming from a more secular perspective, and so they're using non-Christian terms. Anyways, we're still talking like 6th, 5th century BC or BCE with these philosophers. This is the same time period that the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is living in India. It's the same time period that Lao Tzu and Kung Fu Sei, Confucius, are living in Japan. So for whatever reason, I don't know if it's where we're traveling through the galaxy or gamma rays or something in the water, but there is just this plethora of philosophic and religious thought happening in the world that has affected cultures east and west to this day. And so there we go with these monistic materialists. Now the next guy, Anaximander, he was reasoning, how could it be water? Because if water was the underlying substance of all things, why isn't everything just returned to water? And he's thinking it has to be something, water has to be one of the manifestations of the Urstoff. It can't be the Urstoff itself. The Urstoff has to be something below our perception or visibility of the physical material world. And so Anaximander said the underlying substance of all things, it's boundless, it's unlimited, but it's also unnameable. We can't even describe or mention what it is. And I can just picture Anaximander's peers and the other Greeks simply saying, that's really clever, Anaximander, but if you don't know what it is, just say so. Don't just come up with these ethereal terms like, oh, it's unknown or unspeakable or unnameable. But if you're familiar with Chinese philosophy, Lao Tzu begins the Tao Te Ching, same time period. The Tao begins with, the name that can be named is not the eternal name. And I just think that's such a fascinating thing. It's like, this is something beyond the physical observation or naming or categorizing of human beings. And I'm not suggesting that Anaximander was a Taoist, but he's tapping into this idea that there are things below the surface that are beyond the perception or knowability of humans. And whatever everything came from is beyond a name, a category, or a description. And I actually love his answer better than Thales. And that would stand even into the 21st century, right? How do you refute the nameless, the boundless, the unknowable? But I love the mystery, and we have that even in the ancient Greek period. All right, the next guy, moving kind of quick. The next guy is Anaximinis. So very similar to Anaximander's name, but it ends with an ES instead of an ER. So Anaximander believed it was undefinable. Anaximinis goes back to how Thales is doing it, and instead of water, he chooses air. He believes air is the underlying substance of all things. And in addition to air, he adds two mechanisms that either, and he called these condensation or rarefication. So when air is compressed, it becomes dense and solid, and when air is rarefied, it bursts into flame. And here's a little experiment, and I want you guys to try this with me. If you take your hand and put it in front of your mouth, yawn into your hand. Just, do you feel the warmth in that? Now compress a stream of air and blow it into your hand. Do you feel the solidity and the coolness? What further need have we of witnesses? And so he's using this idea of compression or condensation. So like our bones would be like super compressed air, but our spirit would be like fire, rarefied air. So that's like the spark, the fire, the animating principle within us. But compressed air gives us our physicality. But even our spirit, it's just less physically compressed air. And that's Anaximinis. So Thales is water, Anaximinis is air. Now, you might say, come on, Blackburn, tell us more. Well, unfortunately, for a lot of these early pre-Socratic philosophers, all we have is little fragments that have been found, or it's other philosophers mention them in their writing, like gave them a shout out or gave them credit for their ideas. But it's not like we have huge books or lectures or things for a lot of these guys. That's why the pre-Socratics is going to go pretty quickly. When we get to Plato, Aristotle, they wrote volumes upon volumes that we still have to this day. And so there'll be a lot more information. But for these guys, it's kind of like this running start until we get to these almost like encyclopedic philosophers later on. All right, our next guy up is Pythagoras. And Pythagoras kind of changes us up a little because these other guys, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximinis, are dealing more with the physicality of the world. Pythagoras believes the underlying thing from which all things comes is numbers. But numbers are like symbolic, right? They're like these abstract concepts. But what Pythagoras is saying is we can use mathematics, we can use numbers to describe and understand the entire world. And those of you...
Is that who the Pythagorean theorem is named after?
Exactly. A squared plus B squared equals C squared. So most of us know that about Pythagoras and the Pythagoreans, but he has many more formulas and mathematical things that have come down to us. The Pythagorean, it wasn't just Pythagoras, but he was kind of like this mathematical, let me see, his time period is 572 to 500 BCE. If you can, so we're talking 600 years before Christ, this guy's living, and he's created his own like mathematical little cult group. And they were egalitarian. They invited women to study, to learn mathematics, to live in community. They were vegetarians. They believed in the transmigration of souls. They wore white robes, and they applied mathematics to everything that they encountered. The Pythagoreans were responsible for the octave scale in the West. If you're a music major, you've studied music, they simply learned the relationship between links of different string or metals or twine or catgut, whatever you're using, and tone and pitch. And so they actually developed the octave scale. But they also believed the very planets. And the early Greeks did believe in like the orbiting of the planets and the sun, moon, stars, and they called it the singing of the spheres. And so they believed the entire universe was in song, but you should intuitively understand the connection between mathematics and music, right? They are very similar disciplines. Wasn't Beethoven able to was it Beethoven that actually wrote a symphony after he went deaf? But he was able to do that because it was like a mathematical formula. He could actually hear the music through his notations, right? Because each symbol represented a sound as well. And so for the Pythagoreans, they were seeing each symbol representing a piece of reality. So for example, if the number for man was 1 and the number for children was 2, for woman was 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, the number for children. And so they went through and they plotted, they had numbers to describe and calculate the entire world. Not to mention the geometric formulas which they could describe, like the area or the space of a triangle or other shapes. Any thought on, I mentioned, I'm talking pretty quickly, but I mentioned the idea of transmigration of the soul. Anyone want to take a shot? Let me get some other voices in here. Christina's been good participating. How about someone else? Transmigration of the soul. What's that?
Did you talk about it? Because I think I missed that part.
No, I just mentioned it, but I didn't say what it was. You've heard the concept, but probably in different terms.
Did they do that in the Avatar movie? Is that kind of like...
Not that I'm aware of. You would find this concept in Eastern religions mostly.
So would they transport souls to different body or something?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay.
So they believed upon death, your soul did not cease to exist. It simply went into another body.
So is that like reincarnation?
Exactly. It's reincarnation Greek style.
Into a human body or to an animal body or any body?
Hence why the Pythagoreans were vegetarians. And why most Hindus are vegetarian, because you don't necessarily come back in a human body. You might come back in an animal body as well. In fact, the Pythagoreans, not only would they not eat meat, but they also wouldn't eat beans. And the reason they wouldn't eat beans, if you've ever looked at a bean, it's got kind of like a fleshy skin on the outside, and if you open it up, there's like that little embryo thing inside, and it was just too close for the Pythagoreans. I couldn't deal. So no beans, no meat, just vegetarians, and it was tied into this belief of the transmigration of the soul.
So did they believe in like karma, like what goes around kind of comes around, or do they have like a karma?
I do not know that part of the Pythagoreans. I just know their affinity of seeing numbers, that reality could be described in numbers. If Pythagoras was living today, he would feel so vindicated, right? Like all this digital interaction we're doing right now, it's literally all these figures and my beard and the voice coming out of me, it's all made up of zeros and ones that are being translated and interpreted into color, sounds, textures, movement. And it's just numbers being translated. It's why I keep trying to encourage my friends and family and students to unplug, because literally we are in this digital world where we are having to use our minds to translate numbers into things, smells, sight, sounds, objects. And the analog world, where you unplug and you just actually walk out your door into creation, is very different, right? But see, for the Pythagoreans, it was the same. That world was just as much made up of numbers as what's going on here in the Matrix, or in whatever we're doing here.
Whoa. So is that, have you ever heard of like the Fibonacci sequence? I don't know if I'm saying it correctly.
Yes, you are saying it correctly.
Is that similar to that?
Yes.
Like, is that okay?
Now, that didn't come until, if someone wants to Google that for me real quick, I think Fibonacci was like a 12th century monk who came up with that. But Fibonacci, mathematician. But the Pythagoreans are definitely headed that way, right? They're thinking in those sorts of terms. And I don't know if any of you are mathematicians or mathematically minded, but we used to have a math professor here at the school, just incredibly brilliant mathematical mind. And I would always love when we would do college breakout sessions because he would give spiritual teachings, but
For
through...
the Fibonacci sequence, it was 1202 AD. I just looked it up.
Good. I haven't completely lost my memory yet. Thank you. So
Sorry.
that's like 1800 years from the Pythagoreans before someone is able to actually make a calculation for what that looks like. But the Pythagoreans were just brilliant, otherworldly in a lot of ways. But back to, where was I? This mathematician, his name was Tibor. And I loved listening to him talk because that's how he related to God, as the great mathematician. And it was a universe of order. And in fact, the Greeks, their word for the universe was cosmos. And cosmos means order. Chaos is the Greek antonym for cosmos. And we still use the word chaos today to describe disorder. But so when the Greeks looked at the universe, they called it the cosmos because they saw order. They saw, and you can see that even in the galaxies, the spiral of the galaxies, you can see the Fibonacci sequence. And many people have called that the thumbprint of God, like trademarked or copyrighted by God, where you see the Fibonacci sequence. We see that everything in the spiral, in the thumbprint, to the galaxies. But we'll get more into that later. Don't you worry.
So did they use math to calculate, did they use math to go from one side of the continent to another, going through water, traveling through water?
Well, the Pythagoreans certainly would have used math for navigation and those sorts of things.
That's crazy.
But they wanted to be unmolested by the other Greeks, right? So they actually went and started their own like little commune. It just sounds like 6th century math hippies to me, where they're wearing white, they're vegetarians, they're egalitarians, but they're not all interested in the politics and the religion, and they just want this nice, neat, musical, mathematical world, a world of beauty and order and structure. And I think it's super interesting. But anyways, back to this Tibor guy. He saw God as like the ultimate mathematician. And when he created the world, he created a world of order. And part of that ordering is like what Christina brought up, the Fibonacci sequence, and how we can see that from ferns unfolding to seashells, nautilus shells. It's everywhere, in deltas, in the way trees grow. Fibonacci sequences, fractals, right? And I just love this about the Pythagoreans. And this teacher, Tibor, like when he entered into a room, he would actually see it in mathematical relationships. So when he's seeing the tables, chairs, desks, he's seeing like rectangles, squares, and their dimensions and proportions. And that's not how I look at the world at all. I won't tell you how I look at the world right now, but I'm not a mathematician. I appreciate it, but that's not how my brain is wired. But I really do like how the Pythagoreans can use mathematics. And like I said, if they were living today, they would be so excited to see how mathematics are being used and to represent or describe the world. And that's very compatible with the Pythagorean way of thinking. Okay, we're doing good. And the next guy up is Heraclitus. Actually, I'm going to do 2 more, because I think that will wrap up the... we'll see. I might try to do 3 more guys. Can you guys think? Actually, I'm going to stop the video here so they're not so overwhelming. And I think it'll be easier for people to do them in parts.